The Frumkes Center for Writing and Culture at Hunter College presents 10 years of best-selling authors and great thinkers. Each week we broadcast new videos from our 10-year speaker archive online for free at our website. We look forward to seeing you again when it's safe. Please enjoy this presentation from the archives of the Frumkes Center for Writing and Culture at Hunter College.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Frumkes. I'm the director of the Writing Center. Some of you know me, some of you are probably sorry that you know me. Whatever it is, I have a lot of fun here presenting these events because through these portals have come a lot of wonderful writers, thinkers, and people of interest to me, and I hope to you. This season is almost done, and tonight probably is our last event for the fall. It's our writer-in-residence, Barbara Goldsmith, whom I will introduce in just a moment. But just to let you know that we're working very hard on the spring brochure, which is finished but isn't out yet, but it will be coming out, and I hope you all have your addresses on our mailing list. If so, you'll get a brochure in the mail. If not, you'll go to our website and you'll hear all about it. But we have 5 great best-selling authors coming, one a month beginning in January. And then we have our Great Thinkers series, which also takes place in the spring, March or April. I'm not exactly sure when. And there we have Sir Harold Evans coming, and an astrophysicist from Harvard, who's mapping the universe, and Ned Block, who's the world's expert on consciousness. Very interesting topic. He's a great philosopher. And the writers are also wonderful. And then on June 7th, we have our annual Writers Conference, Saturday, June 7th, here at the college. And that's a very, very exciting event. And we have keynote speakers and a grand luncheon and maybe 12 different panels running every 3 hour during the day with very eminent writers and publishers and literary agents and books that they will sign for you, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very full and exciting year for us, and the spring probably is it's thrilling for me, and I hope it will be thrilling for you. That said, and if there's ever anything that we can do for you in terms of your own writing skills, I forgot all about our courses. We still have our courses that we run, taught by professional writers, the fiction courses and various other courses, and we have 2 master classes in the spring. One is with Daphne Merkin, the memoir course that many people have. She's been teaching for quite a while. And the other is a creative nonfiction course with Bruce J. Friedman, the great, Bruce is a great writer, and you may remember him. He's master of the short story. He wrote a memoir that came out last year called Lucky Bruce. One of his short stories became The Heartbreak Kid. He wrote Stir Crazy, and he wrote he won an Oscar for his screenplay for Splash. If not an Oscar or something for that. And he's a joy to be with. He's one of the funniest, brightest, most talented writers I know. So if any of you are interested in spending time up close and personal with a very, very fine talent and a fascinating man, Bruce J. Friedman. But we have all our other courses too. That said, I'm going to introduce our speaker tonight, who is our writer-in-residence for the 2013 term. And Barbara is a very, very special lady, and you'll learn just how special in a moment. Barbara Goldsmith and I had a lot in common before we ever met. We both grew up in New Rochelle, a sweet little suburb just 25 minutes north of the city, where we fell in love with books at the same library. and we both inherited some Pepsi-Cola stock. In my case, 10 shares from my grandfather, which I still have, and in Barbara's case, I believe a bit more. We would also both write later on for Harper's Bazaar magazine. Beyond that, the similarity ends. Barbara went to Wellesley College and Columbia University, after which she initiated the Creative Environment series, interviewing in depth such iconic figures as Marcel Breuer, I.M. Pei, George Balanchine, and Pablo Picasso, about the creative process. Her series caught the eye of Clay Felker at the New York Herald Tribune, and when the Tribune failed in 1967, she helped Felker found New York Magazine and joined him there as a founding editor and writer. Tom Wolfe admired Barbara's work enough to honor her with inclusion in his anthology, The New Journalism. In 1974, Barbara became an advisor to the Hearst Corporation and senior editor of Harper's Bazaar. After these early accomplishments, Barbara's rise in letters was meteoric. In 1975, she published her first book, The Straw Man, a novel about the New York art world, which garnered praise. And then Little Gloria, Happy at Last, the nonfiction narrative about the 1930s custody battle for Gloria Vanderbilt, aka Little Gloria, which became a bestseller at both the New York Times and Publishers Weekly. Little Gloria was followed by Johnson versus Johnson, which recounted the longest, most expensive will contest in United States history, which received endless accolades for its narrative style and power. She then targeted women's suffrage with a book about Victoria Woodhull, which became a finalist for the Los Angeles Book Prize, and then published the brilliant book, Obsessive Genius, The Inner World of Marie Curie, which has been translated into 21 languages and won Best Book Prize from the American Institute of Physics, as well as the Knight's Cross of the Order of Merit Medal for service to the Republic of Poland. The book will soon be adapted as a major joint HBO-Sony production. Consider, too, if you will, that Barbara received 2 television Emmys for Little Gloria, has been honored as a literary lion by the New York Public Library, received a Lifetime Achievement Award from Literacy Partners, received a presidential citation from New York University, was elected to the Council on Foreign Relations, to the New York State Council on the Arts, etc., etc. As if all these literary accomplishments were not enough, Barbara has also been called one of the 10 most enlightened philanthropists of our time, along with David Rockefeller and Brooke Astor, by Vartan Gregorian, president of the Carnegie Corporation. Suffice that among her numerous philanthropies has been the preservation and conservation of books. In this capacity, beyond what she has done for the New York Public Library, she has served on the Presidential Commission on Preservation under the Clinton administration and received the Archival Association's top award. There is, of course, more to Barbara, far more, but then we wouldn't have time to hear Barbara in person. So without further ado, I present our 213 Gerda Vanderbilt Whitney Connor Writer-in-Residence for the Hunter College Writing Center, Barbara Goldsmith. Barbara, do you need this with you or should?
No.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Now I don't have to say a word about my career. I know all of you are interested in writing, or you wouldn't be here. And I want to leave a lot of time tonight for your questions. Your questions always teach me a lot about my writing. It's a fascinating experience to know what readers and aspiring writers and writers are thinking and questioning. But tonight I don't have to say too much about how I became a writer, and I will leave that amount of time. I think, how long do we have?
Well, up to 30 minutes to speak. Any shorter than that is fine, and another however long it is for questions.
Excellent. Okay. What I can give you tonight are a few pointers on what it is to write a book. And perhaps those of you who are interested in the craft of writing, and make no mistake about it, it is a craft. Sorry. Oh, you want me to use, I'm so mic'd up here. Would be interested in knowing this. Norman Mailer, at age 40, said that when people came up to him and said, oh, I could write the most wonderful book, and then gave a long explanation about how they didn't have the time, or they just needed somebody to pluck the story out of them. He said that, Mailer said that instead of punching them, which he wanted to do, he would say, well, you must understand that learning to write is just as difficult as learning to play the piano. For writers, and I actually am no exception, they're not adept at exactly explaining what they do. And indeed, many very good writers don't seem to understand the process of writing themselves. William Faulkner thought of himself, quote, as a man running along behind the characters with a pencil in his hand, trying to put down what they said and did. And I love that image. And Somerset Maugham wrote, there are 3 rules for writing. Unfortunately, no one can remember what they are. But for me, the most pertinent of all this was Marianne Moore, who warned writers and readers, be there when the writing or reading is going on. And that meant just really concentrate, whether it's an essay or a novel or a nonfiction book. You just find it true that you have to do something that I have always thought was essential to writing, and I call it enter my world. You can't write about someone unless you know the world in which they lived. And this is an essential, an absolute essential. And if you don't know how they feel, how the society viewed them, what their politics were, you just don't know. You're writing then in a bell jar. And those books are totally uninteresting. They're a compilation of either facts or an idea you had one morning about somebody that struck you as interesting, but you never went further. And you must enter their world. It's as if you were jumping into a pond and you have to follow all the circles around. And then you begin to understand what it is they did under the pressure of where they lived. We really don't understand how difficult it is for many writers to be so immersed in a period. When I wrote my Curie book, there were over 2,000 books or essays that had been written on Marie Curie. And someone said to me, do you want to write a book on Marie Curie? I said, that's the last thing I want to do is write a book on this icon. And then about 3 months later, Robert Darnton called from the Bibliothèque Nationale in France and said, did you know that they've just released these Curie papers that have been sealed for over 70 years because they were radioactive. And now we've decontaminated them and nobody's seen them. Are you interested? I was on the next plane. And out of that came the Marie Curie, Obsessive Genius, the Inner World of Marie Curie. A woman who was such an icon that nobody thought of her as a woman who raised 2 children and had no idea how to do it, and as a woman who had, after her husband died, an affair with a married man and was called a whore, while the man got away perfectly clean. He was a rake and a ladies' man. Those were the morals of the times. In order to get a scientific education, she had to hide under the seats in the lecture hall because they did not allow women in any of their science courses at the Sorbonne at that time. And the Sorbonne was one of the few places that even took women. She was Polish. She was not French. She lived and was brought up very, very poor. I mean, so poor that an apple was an enormous treat. In a country that was no longer called Poland, it was called the Vistula, and divided into 3 parts. And she lived in Warsaw, which was under the Russian part, and not allowed to speak Polish. And her father, who was a teacher, was no longer allowed to teach when they found out that he was giving secret classes in Polish pride. And this very difficult background, I think, gave her the spine to do whatever she wanted. And she was too poor and under the radar to be very interested in the conventions of the day. For example, nobody went unescorted by a man, no woman, but she would have someone like Pierre Curie up to her little attic and they'd sit on crates and talk about science for hours on end. He appreciated, one of the few people who appreciated her for her mind. And so it was that icon that disappeared as I wrote Obsessive Genius. And I'm very proud to say from 22 languages, it's now up to 24. It's something that most people can identify with. I always thought she was an icon. When I was a teenager, I had a bulletin board, and pinned up on my bulletin board between my bowling card and a reproduction of Van Gogh's Starry Night was a Marie Curie quote, and it went as follows: "Nothing in life is to be feared, it is only to be understood. It is important to make a dream of life, and of a dream, reality." It was only much later that I discovered that Pierre, not Marie, had written those lines. And so there are many misconceptions about people you go in to write about. And we live in a world that's very difficult in that the transmission of so-called information is so instantaneous and so overwhelming that we hardly have time to sort it out before it vanishes, and then we're overwhelmed again by another tsunami of information. We're assaulted by the changing spin on events. Nobody remembers the bitter Clinton Hillary Clinton-Obama campaign. What he said about her, she said about him. She ended up Secretary of State when he was president, doesn't matter. This changing vocabulary, what matters is that it washes away literary borders as well as moral borders. People no longer simply say, I lied. They say, well, that was disinformation. That was disinformation. And a lot of things that people do now are not in the public interest. They're in the interest of changing one's image. I had a terrible experience with my youngest son who was in college, and I said to him, if Obama wants to get elected, I was working hard for Obama for the first time, what should he do? And my son said, oh, he should give the appearance of really wanting to help the poor. And I said, how would you help the poor? He said, I didn't say he should help the poor. I said he should give the appearance of wanting to help the poor. That's the society we live in. The kids are far more cynical, I think, than anyone in this room. And they have to be. They've been brought up where things are not immutable. There is no Johnny Appleseed or person like that to admire. And our icons are all dead. Elvis Presley, Marilyn Monroe. Reason for that is they can't change their image. It's everlasting. It's out there and it's everlasting. I like this quote that Daniel Boorstin wrote about our culture. He said, we are at the risk of being the first people in all history to make our illusions so vivid and persuasive, so realistic, that we can live in them. And the recent Janklevich study warned, we must be vigilant against the message of the media that says that our sons and daughters' brand of sneakers or cosmetics are more important than what they actually think, feel, know, or do. And the pundit Max Frisch said, technology is the knack of so arranging the world that we no longer have to experience it or acknowledge any truth. Well, those are very hard judgments, but I must say they do pertain. And how do they pertain to writing? Well, in entering a world, you have to still keep your own voice. The voice is, if you ask me, one of the most important things in reading a book. I recently went on a trip to Portugal, and a painter had gray canvases with just one line, and I could walk around the room and tell you who every writer was, because the voice of the writer came through in one line. Just hang on, no matter what happens. When I was a college freshman, I thought I was pretty good. You know, I'd have all the local newspapers publish stuff and my high school magazine. And so the first assignment was, it usually is, what did you do last summer? 1,500 words. And I got mine back. It had a big red C on it, And next to the C, the only comment was, dangling participle. And I thought, oh my God, if I stay with this teacher, I'm going to end up losing my voice. Luckily, I went to a school where we had a freshman advisor, and I explained, and with this little tear trickling down, how terrible this was, and I was going to lose my voice, and she was fine. She transferred me to being an art history major. And so when I came out of college, I had something to write about, as well as keeping my voice. And the biggest compliment anyone can give me is, I knew it was you when I was through the first couple of pages of this book. It's a wonderful feeling. It's just, and the third requirement for a writer is curiosity. I would say never accept the common wisdom. It's usually wrong. If you're curious, you pick up on things that other people have ignored. For example, where's the concert from? For example, when I wrote Other Powers, The Age of Suffrage, Spiritualism, and the scandalous Victoria Woodhull, I wasn't looking to write that book, but I had found in the trial transcript for Little Gloria Happy at Last, they had that reporters asked Commodore Vanderbilt how he became the richest man in America. And he said, well, just do as I do, listen to the spirits. I get my best financial advice from Victoria Woodhull when she's in a trance state. And I thought, what? That is crazy. Is he putting us on? Who is this person, or does she exist? Well, of course, I resurrected her out of the history books, and I found out that Victoria Woodhull indeed existed. She was 100 years before her time. She believed in no-fault divorce, women having custody of their children, and gaining the right to vote. So much so that in 1872, she ran against Horace Greeley and Ulysses S. Grant for President of the United States on her own ticket, for which she was arrested and thrown in the Ludlow Street jail. Well, there are a few other things about writing that obsess me, and one is detail. It's so easy to be seduced by detail, but not every detail is very good. Most of them aren't. You throw out 90%, and then what you keep should illuminate something. For example, on a week before Commodore Vanderbilt died, they emptied every stable in New York of its tarmac and put it right down Fifth Avenue and right in front of where his room was, so the carriage wheels would not bother him while he was dying. And I thought, what emperor, what person today could possibly command that? And when he died, they had to close the stock market for 4 days. And okay, he had $100 million. That's a statistic. But when you contrast it with the average Civil War veteran getting $4 a week, then you see the enormity of what that fortune was. So it's try to get the detail that means something, and try to get a detail that really contrasts with something else, even if it doesn't seem to mean much in its own venue. Mrs. Greeley truly went insane because she had instructions on how to press a shirt, and it involved 20 items, and she ended up taking the iron and throwing it across the room. I would too. 20 items, my goodness. And that was the code of the day. It was a very vicious time to live in. 4 states stipulated the size of the instrument with which you could beat your wife. These kinds of things just pop up. So that's a wonderful thing for me to find, and I think it's fun to read. I just also think that there are other things like trying to get to primary materials, interviewing people. Bob Gottlieb, my wonderful editor, always said, do the oldest people first and then work your way down. And it was wonderful. And I've been to 7 countries to do these interviews. I just love it. And there are other rules. You know, if I were a writer starting out, I would tell writers, take the first bus. It's very difficult to crash into publishing these days, not like when I wrote my first novel. It was enough then to write a book that, well, I've written 5 and they've all been New York Times bestsellers, but the first one surprised me so much. I had left a job because I wanted to write, and I put it in the bottom drawer because I didn't know whether I had written a book or not. And I have to credit my friend Tom Wolfe, who kept calling and saying, well, is it finished? And I would say yes. And he said, well, did you send it to my publisher? Well, not yet, but you know, I'm going to do that. And it would stay in the bottom drawer. And one day my phone rang, and this voice said, this is Roger Strauss of Farrar Straus. Why don't you bundle up that manuscript, because I'm sending someone to pick it up this afternoon. And indeed they did. And the next morning he called me and said, we'll publish this. We like it very much. So confidence goes a long way. And I think with my career, it took a long time to build that confidence. But once I did, it was self-generating. I remember my very, very first job, which was take the first bus between high school and college. I worked for Town and Country magazine. My first day, I was 17. The phone rang, and this voice said, this is Arthur Modell, and I have a lunch date with your editor, Henry Sell, and I want to know if I can bring my friend, Mr. Steinwitz, with me. And so I went in. Henry always had an open door, and I relayed this message to him, and he said, oh, darling, there are no 2 greater bores in the entire world, and to get them over with at the same lunch would be sheer heaven. So I trotted back to the telephone and I said, Mr. Sell says that if you bring your friend, it would be sheer heaven. And I hung up, and he popped out of the office and he said, one day you'll do. And that was the very editor who, after college, I was such an execrable, terrible typist, and in those days we used whiteout, and my letters were all whiteout. He said, well, you know, I have a choice here. I can fire you or you can do something else. And I said, well, I can write. He said, okay. the person who wrote the shopping column just quit. Go write the shopping column. And I did. And then he let me do interviews. And there I was, fresh out of school, writing about Clark Gable, Deborah Carr, Audrey Hepburn, all of these wonderful top stars that my grandchildren have never heard of. Who's that guy on the bookshelf with you, they say. Good looking, he was good looking. But when that was very successful, I went to another magazine and they let me write about what Lewis was talking about I.M. Pei, Picasso, Balanchine, Lincoln Kirsten, all of whom people thought were difficult interviews, but I found another thing, which was if you're interested in their world and there's an empathy, you find out the most astounding things. And eventually we built on that. And I've been doing it ever since, and I hope to be doing it for a while longer. It's a great pleasure to do it, and sometimes a great burden because you're in that room all isolated and you feel there's a life going on out there, but it's not yours. Yours is in this little box writing, and it's hard to start. So with that, I see a hands up already, so I'm going to leave the rest for questions.
Thank you, Barbara. The young lady right here.
Just a comment and a question. You said something about the icons, iconic figures, that their legacy is set. They're not, because a lot of them have now sold. The descendants have sold those images, and you see them on television now doing all kinds of things that they never did. It's the manipulation of the image, primarily for commercial reasons. But my question is, how do you know, if it's answerable, when to stop your research?
When to stop?
Your research.
How do you know when to stop your research?
I never do. My Bob Gottlieb always used to say, Barbara, you would go to Canada for a safety pin. Goethe said, a work of art is never finished, it's only finally abandoned. And that's sort of how I feel about research. At some point, you have to start putting all these puzzle pieces together and then just do it the best you can and abandon them.
I want to thank you for very illuminating and mind-opening remarks, and share with you 2 points that I think touch on something that you said. To me, biography is the best vehicle of studying and understanding history, because through the individual that's the subject of the biography, you could try to make sense of the disparate events that all of us go through in the world, whether it's past, present, or future. The second point that I wanted to share with you was that I think sometimes we shouldn't de-emphasize perception, because perception creates reality on many times. In the law, and I'm a lawyer, it's said it's not only the appearance, it's not only the reality of justice, but the appearance of justice, because people who are then participating have to rise to the standard that is out there.
What was the question?
It wasn't a question. I was
Well, there is a question there. I know when I wrote Johnson versus Johnson, it was like Bleak House. The lawyers walked away with almost $30 million. The question could have been settled over a cup of tea. It was 6 kids, each of which, the least of which had $100 million. And as you said, perception, I couldn't figure out why they would expose themselves to having things about their father come out that were really distasteful, incest, neglect, all this kind of stuff. And I finally understood that they were looking for some sort of emotional reparation that they could never get, and the money was only tangential to that. And then when you say about perception, the other part of your comment, which I agree with, we're constantly changing our image. When I was in California, I had an assistant named Betty Sims who wrote me the other day, just last week, and said, I've decided to modify my image, and from now on I will be called Delia Gold. And so she's no longer Miss Sims, she's Miss Gold. America is a great country for manufacturing an image and then living it.
Anyone else? You, Norman, you wanted to add on?
Just responding to your very, your insightful observation. 2 areas of the law that ultimately boiled down to a grudge match, having no rationality, more often than not are the matrimonial disputes and the estate litigation. I had a case a number of years ago where it was a brother and sister who were fighting over the fathers, in the reality, who was going to get the father's fishing rod.
Yes, well, they're looking for something else that unfortunately they'll probably never find.
Do we have any other questions? Otherwise, why don't you join us in the rear, and Barbara will be happy to inscribe a book for you if you would like, and answer any other questions, and join us for a cup of coffee and some sweets if you wish. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you.